Hi, welcome back to ICE. In this video, we're going to look at usability testing. And in this video, you will be provided with an overview of different methods for usability testing. So what's usability? Well, it can be defined as the extent to which end users can successfully accomplish required goals in a specified environment subject to various comfort, effectiveness, and satisfaction criteria. So the notion of usability is pretty general. It's not just usable for website design, but for any software that you build, in fact. So any software or even a tool that you build, not computing related, you can still think about usability of a tool. Think of a hammer, is it usable? Design a chair, is it really usable? And so on. So it's a general notion, although we will look at usability in particular for software and also for web design. And one of the key things about usability is we don't know until we test it with users. So as mentioned some time back, we will adopt an iterative approach when developing websites. So you do an analysis of the requirements, you design a website, and then you build a prototype, and then you test it with users. And sometimes this prototype can be just a paper prototype, and we'll see examples of what a paper prototype actually means. And then after that, you go on to get the feedback from the user and then improve your design, and then you might then build another prototype, show it to the user, and then user has some feedback, and you keep building prototypes. So you iterate over versions of the website, you iterate over the prototypes of the website until finally you get an improved version, and then you deploy it, and then you get some more feedback, and then you go back to design, implement, and then test it, and then and so on, right? So it is you're stepping through the software life cycle, if you like, many times in the lifetime of a particular website or in the lifetime of a particular software system. So what do we want to evaluate? We want to evaluate the design layout, the look and feel of the website, the flow of interactions, right? Is it logical? For instance, you get a series of links to accomplish a task. Is it logical? Does it make sense? Are important tasks easy to do through the website, and so on? So you want to look at how to measure performance and satisfaction. You want to identify, assess usability defects. You want to provide ideas as to how a system might be improved. You want to educate the design team based on user feedback. So usability is pretty important, right? So you got many competing websites, but the one that is the most usable will end up being used actually, or at least being used the most. There are two main categories of usability testing: empirical testing, which is testing involving the users. So you actually bring in the users and get them to use the system and then measure their performance and so on. So you actually deal with the people, bringing in people. Yeah, that's hence the word empirical. And the inspection testing approach is a cheaper approach because you don't have to pay people to come in to test it, but it could still be useful, right? So you're basically inspecting the design, inspecting the prototype based on certain criteria. That's the inspection testing idea. And we'll look at both. So these are the phases for product usability testing in general, applicable to website design, but also for any product that you want to create. So you look at the analysis, you investigate opportunities are the needs, and then you design and build something based on prototypes, documentation, and then you kind of release it, or you get users to test it, and then you can iterate over the phases. Okay, so what's empirical testing? That's testing involving actual users coming in and doing the tests in the laboratory. As the user uses the system, what you want to do is to film them, right? And take a video camera, point at them as they're using the system, and you kind of see what the user experience is, if you like. And after using the system, they might fill in a questionnaire to evaluate the system, to provide their opinions about different aspects of the system. And then based on the results from the questionnaire and looking at the user's experience or behavior as they're using the system, you can then refine the product. And you can go through this stage again and again. So the primary focus is to use the results of the testing to refine the versions of the product. So there are three types of testing. One is a fixed laboratory testing, and then there's portable usability testing and remote usability testing, right? Three types of empirical testing. So let's look at examples of all these three. So in a fixed laboratory testing, you basically have a room, right? So suppose you are quite a well-off, well-to-do company, and you can afford a room that's available, and you can bring in testers into the room to do the in-house testing. And then the users come in, you brief them, you sit them down, you get them to accomplish different tasks through your website or through your prototype system. And then after that, they fill in a questionnaire and you record them as they're doing their tasks. Sometimes you even time them to see how long they take to do particular tasks. We'll come back to that later. So the user interacts with the product or the prototype created by the development team, and then you record it. You can video, camera them as they do the. So everything is in place, right? So it's easy to do, but of course it could be expensive because you have to set up the room in the first place, and you have to pay the users to come in. And of course, there are consequences. So what kind of consequences? Well, users are being paid to conduct the test and they have come all the way in, right? So they may be pretty inclined to give a positive feedback. After all, you're paying them, right? So it can be slightly biased. So you can improve it. So you can kind of make it more comfortable for them. And yeah, and instead of looking at them in the same room, standing over their shoulder while they are doing the task, you might set up a room, something like an interrogation room in the police department, right? You leave the users alone in the room, or at least they feel that they are alone in the room as they are doing the task, and you kind of observe them from behind a glass window, for instance, and you videotape them, right? So they may not feel so intimidated. So this enables the observer to view the tester through that one-way glass. So the new layout could be useful, right? And you leave the testers do what they do without needing to be too worried about someone overlooking their shoulder, right? But of course, it's expensive to do that. So with portable usability testing, instead of getting the users to come in and having a room specially fitted for testing, what we do is we pack everything in a bag, even the system, and we go to where the users are. So if you design the website for a company, for instance, instead of asking the people from the company to come in to where you are and having the need to set up this in-house testing room and all that, we go to the company and we show them the product and we get them to test. Right? So that's the portability usable testing in a nutshell. So the product is tested while the user interact with it in their own environment. So we might allow the user to we actually deploy a prototype of the system in the user's company, in the user's environment, for instance, and let them use it. And we might still videotape them or video camera them as they use the system and get feedback from them. So you got to set up the equipment in such a way that is pretty natural, right, as they are interacting with the system. So you might also have two monitors. So one is the monitor that the actual user is looking at. Another monitor is the developer looking at the same thing that the user is looking at, but able to tell, for instance, if the user is having trouble with the system and so on. And in both the empirical fixed laboratory testing as well as portable testing, you might encourage the users to think out loud while they undertake the task. So, for instance, if the user is confused and so on, they are thinking out loud. In remote usability testing, where you don't have to travel even to where the testers are, the testers just do it remotely. They connect through the internet to your system, provide feedback through the internet, you monitor them through the internet. So that's a remote usability testing idea. So you observe them just through the connection. But of course, limited. Right? For all you know, there could be a cat on the other side of the internet tapping at the keyboard. Right? You can't even see what's going on the remote side. Okay, so let me just show you some pictures of empirical testing. Okay, so this is a document from Oval Studios, and while it's dated, it's still relevant today. There are still software houses which has rooms that look like this. You notice there's a glass window there to observe the user as they are using the system. And then this is the setup that you might have. Here's another example of a usability testing lab. You can see that there's a glass window here and you can observe the user as he or she is doing the task. And this is an example of the equipment that you use for portable usability testing. So you pack everything, including the system, your software, your prototype, into a bag. You go to where the users are, open the bag, take out the system, get them to test it, and you monitor them as they do so. Okay, so in the test procedure, you have your subject and you have the computer that you want to test, and you might have a monitor that you can use to observe the same screen as the user. And basically, you just get them to perform a set of tasks, and we'll look at more examples of that, and to measure their performance as they perform these tasks and to get feedback from the users about those tasks. So for instance, if you're testing a website like Amazon and you got a first version of it, the one task might be to get the user to find a product and then to purchase that product, for instance. Or another task might be to get the user to put up something for sale, and then you time the user, you get an idea of how fast or slow the user takes to perform those tasks. Okay, so but we'll look at a few more examples about how to conduct empirical testing and even the idea of testing using a paper prototype, not just using a piece of software. And the key advantage of empirical testing is compared to inspection testing is that with inspection testing you don't actually involve the users. You just measure the system with respect to a given set criteria, as we will look at later. But in empirical testing, because we involve the users, we get direct feedback from users, and sometimes it's unexpected. We can observe how the user interacts with the system, and there may be some things that we never thought was a problem, but it is a problem, or things that we think might be a problem, but wasn't a problem at all. So, getting a direct observation of the user's reaction is the key advantage of empirical testing. But of course, it is costly to do that. Inspection testing is sometimes called the discount usability engineering method simply because it's cheaper to do and you can do it a lot faster. So you have some members of your software team designated as usability inspectors, and what they do is just inspect the design or maybe even inspect the prototype and then try and capture or highlight potential problems. And we'll look at two examples. One's called a cognitive walkthrough and the other is called a heuristic evaluation. So in cognitive walkthrough, you basically have a set of task scenarios, and you basically walk through virtually, if you like, or cognitively walk through that scenario. And this is very similar to code walkthrough, right? So if you're familiar with the idea of code walkthrough, is where one member of the team who implemented one part of the software system will present his or her own part to the rest of the team, explaining the code to them, explaining his or her code to the rest of the team members. And this is the idea of if you like, cognitively debugging the code. Because when you explain the code to the rest of the team members, you're doing some reflection. You're testing your own understanding of it. And similar to this idea of cognitive walkthrough. Right? So you may have some feature or some aspect of the design done by one member of the team, and this member of the team might then present that aspect or that design to the rest of the team members. So for instance, in a previous lecture, not necessarily lecture 10, you might have a lecture where you design the site navigation net, something like this. Right? Say you design the leftmost branch about entering the booking details, confirming the booking details, and all that. And suppose you design that part of the website. So you might present or try to explain that part of the design to the rest of the team members. And in doing so, you're walking through that part of the design and in a way debugging your design as you go. So if you look at warehouse booking, for example, right, you can kind of walk through that part. And if you're explaining that to other team members, it gives you a means to kind of think through your design, if you like. So you might create a form where you record your reflections on the design. So the name of the tester, and you see whether you can identify issues. So you kind of walk through your design to determine whether there are certain things that users may have difficulty with. Right? For instance, a plus sign may be overlooked. Sometimes the correct flow may not be so obvious from the design. So continuing, so you might fill in a form that actually records the problems identified as you're walking through that particular aspect of the website in the presence of your other team members, for instance, right? So you find that, for example, clicking on a certain button doesn't match the user's goals and so on. So this is just an example. So it's a step-by-step evaluation of the interface, and you could do that with a paper prototype, and I'll explain what a paper prototype means in a bit later. Or you can do that with an actual prototype implementation of the system, or you can just do that with the SNN, with the design diagrams, right? So at different stages, you can be doing this cognitive walkthrough. And there's some examples that you can have a look at. Heuristic evaluation is the type of testing that we're going to do in your assignment. So you basically have a design guidelines, so a bunch of rules that you, as a checklist if you like, and those rules will relate to these 9 aspects: the visibility of system status, matching between system and the real world, and so on. And we'll go through these 9 aspects. And you have the design guidelines that we saw, very early on in this subject, would relate to these heuristics. Right? So for instance, the logo has to be put in the right place. So you can check a box if that's satisfied. Or the navigation bar is in the right place. Check another box if that's the case. Right? So you can create a checklist that relates to these 9 aspects, but of course you might not just have 9 points, you may have more than 9 points, but those points might relate to one or more of these aspects. So look and feel, right? So all these heuristic evaluation criteria or rules that you set up, the checklist that you set up, might relate to look and feel, and they might relate to functionality. And some of it could be a bit subjective, but some could be more objective. So of course you can do it by a group of people and then they can compare notes. And it's certainly cheap and easy to do. And this is definitely the testing that you will do. And the developers themselves can carry out these tests. So for instance, you look at this aspect of visibility of system status. Does the system let one know where one is? Right? For example, we had this idea of the breadcrumbs that we saw a couple of weeks ago. So breadcrumbs is one way to make system status visible. Right? Or does the system acknowledge that an action request has been carried out? So once the user fill in the form and click submit, is there feedback to tell the user, okay, we have received your input and so on, or is the feedback not there? Consistency and standard with respect to the following. So you might have message display methods. You don't want messages to be displayed all over the place. So sometimes it's in the left hand corner, sometimes in the right hand corner. That could be confusing. Colors, we also talked about that previously. And what data entry methods are supported, definition of special keys if they are. Match between system and real world, especially with metaphors. For instance, we got this idea of the shopping cart as a metaphor. And if you do have a shopping cart and you click on a shopping cart, you should go to a shopping cart. Right? You shouldn't go to some other information. Right? So there should be consistency with real world metaphors that you use. And if you think about a university website, you think about the natural structure of a university in terms of faculties or schools and colleges. In the case of Latrobe, then you want to have a similar structure reflected in your website. Right? Otherwise, it will be really confusing for the user. Flexibility and efficiency of use. So you might have some criteria that's based on time taken for task completion, download times, and all that. Right? So for instance, one of in your checklist, you may have a guideline that says, okay, every page should download within 3 seconds, for instance. And then if that's satisfied, then you can check that in your checklist. I'll give an example of a checklist later. So other aspects could be helping users to recognize, diagnose, recover from errors. For example, why an action cannot be performed, or the system could give prompts about how to proceed if there's an error. For instance, the information on a form is incorrectly filled in. Can you provide a useful prompt for the user? Tell the user what would be a more appropriate input, for instance. Yeah. And if the action is not allowed, why? Tell the user why. Right? So it's nothing more frustrating than the user trying to figure out why the system is not accepting certain inputs, for instance, or certain results are not obtained. Okay, so heuristic evaluation is widely used, and this amount of effort and can be done by the developers themselves is certainly a lot cheaper than empirical user testing. But of course, certain things it probably will not be able to pick out compared to getting a user coming in and using your system and testing your system. Right? There's no way to get user reactions with heuristic evaluation. But if you want to save costs, that could be an approach to use. And of course, it could be biased because the inspectors could be the developers of the system themselves. Okay, so there are a number of examples here and websites that you can look at. But we'll show you an example. Okay, here's an example of a checklist that is used for heuristic evaluation. So in the video, just now I mentioned a whole list of things that you can look for about the website, and you can put them all down as a checklist, and you can create a checklist like this relating to those 9 different aspects. Or here they provide a different classification of the checklist, but you can see that it's quite similar to those 9 aspects. Here in this example from this company, it's dated but still useful. You might create a checklist applicable to websites in general. So the navigation aspects, functionality aspects, the control aspects, the language aspects, feedback, consistency. Remember we mentioned this. Feedback about system status, for instance. Error prevention, does the system explain to the user what happens or why certain actions cannot be done? the visual clarity aspects, and so on. So what I've shown you just now was a checklist that's applicable to websites in general. But if you were building a specific type of website, for example, you're building university websites or a retail website, create checklists which are specialized for a certain category of websites. So in this example, this is, if you like, a refinement or specialization of the previous checklist, which is applicable specifically for online retail websites. So those websites where you sell or buy stuff through. So you have navigation and then finding products. You notice that this is not generally applicable for all websites, but because this is for online retail websites, finding products becomes important, and there's some criteria that you can evaluate. And then there's purchasing, issues about purchasing, customer services, error prevention, correction, layout, and visual clarity. So it's very similar to the previous checklist, but it is specialized for retail websites. And if you're building a university website, you can design a different checklist for that as well. So the design guidelines that we mentioned uh, in the first few weeks of this subject, many of these design guidelines can be listed as points in a checklist like this. And that's what we want you to do in the assignment as well, to come up with a checklist based on the design guidelines in this subject or based on other examples or other ideas that you think about. And you can create and design your own checklist and use it for your assignment system.